Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Brenton Lengel. So, this is something that we didn't quite get a chance to fully flesh out. But in a recent debate we had, one of the things that I brought up was with socialism and art, and what is socialism. One of the things I've noticed, let me sort of put a context on this. The people that become socialists, say like on YouTube or the internet where you get to see them, a lot of them are what I call the disaffected or misunderstood intellectuals. They are either artists or intellectuals or whatever, and they think that the system as it currently is established isn't giving them full scope. And that in their mind, they see socialism as a system that would be better at giving them full scope to what they want to do. And I mean, I'm not going to argue that the current system isn't constraining and confining in a lot of ways. Obviously it is. I think what I thought would be the more interesting question is, if that is the case, because really what it sounds like they're complaining about is politics in this decision-making process. There's interests that have a bigger say in the kind of art that gets made or done. And those bigger interests are either A, unaccountable, or B, don't choose to acknowledge the potential that these creators might have. And so they think, well, socialism is better because then we have accountable institutions. We have a way that we can more easily achieve these goals for ourselves as creators. I think that's fairly accurate. Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I'd say it's fair. It's a little simplistic, but I won't say that there's definitely not there's definitely an aspect of that in my move towards becoming a socialist and an anarchist. I think there's a couple of things behind why people start identifying as socialists. And to be fair, also, I should add that it's not simply intellectuals and artists who go down that route. I mean, socialism, to a certain extent, if you are going to enter the field of radical politics, you have to have a certain level of education, and that tends to attract people who are, who have been both educated and empowered, but then also disenfranchised by the system. But I would also say that as far as socialism goes, sorry, I had a little feedback in my microphone here. I mean, I would also say that there's elements of compassion as well that go along with it. It's not just self-interest, but frustrated self-interest and frustrated ambition can definitely point someone in the direction of becoming a political radical.
Let me just interject here. I wasn't insinuating that was the only reason, but that's a common one. It's one that I see a lot.
Yeah, I'd say it is. I mean, we have a system that doesn't really serve a lot of members of society, especially not intellectuals and artists. Capitalism. I used to, when I worked a day job, I used to do a lot to do with arts fundraising in the United States. And I used to say to my coworkers and employees very frequently, in fact, this was part of my official training for a while, that we in America do not so much support the arts as actively hate them and try to destroy them at every opportunity. And I think similar things happen with intellectual thought within our country. There's a couple of artists that get selected by the market to have the privilege of essentially selling their art to a certain extent, either as entertainment or, in the case of fine art, as for lack of a better term, a pump and dump scheme by the richest families in the country, as well as a way to avoid taxation. But beyond those chosen few golden children of our society, most people who are temperamentally pulled in the direction of arts or intellectual pursuits are heavily discouraged by market forces from pursuing those. And I can tell you from personal experience, it's an incredibly frustrating place to be.
Yeah. Now, as far as the sort of Well, I don't know if maybe you did understand. Maybe you were preparing a response to my art charge, but we didn't really have a chance. It was almost over as soon as I made it.
Yeah, I apologize on that one. Because part of the reason why that we were so pressed for time was I was having computer troubles at the beginning, so we may have charged past it. And I thought that was a very interesting thing to bring up.
So let me just rephrase it for anybody that hasn't heard it, and then I can kind of get your take on it. So if we look at, okay, this is an already existing socialist system, right? I'm assuming that, where we have democratic decision making. And so everybody has to, for lack of a better word, let's call it the Workers' Soviet Council. They're going to vote on who gets the resources, this month for their use. People who do a lot of like physical labor, like farming or factory work, it's obvious that they've earned a share of the surplus because they're producing it. Someone who's producing aesthetic content obviously is important. You and I wouldn't disagree with that. But I don't think it's as easy as sell. And so what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to say, well, look, I need resources. I need leisure time. I need, what if I'm a painter, I need canvases and paintbrushes. If I'm a novelist, I need, printing presses and paper, or today, computer laptops. So how are we going to divvy up the resources? And so the best way to do it is to say, well, look, get a certain, whatever the mechanism is, the democratic mechanism, get enough share of that mechanism to then support the transfer of, the collective resources for your project. But what I see as a potential hazard there is that you have to, as you please more and more interest groups within this democratic decision-making process, you then have to, in some sense, maybe compromise your work is the wrong word, but you have to sort of spread your work thin in the sense that, okay, this group wants this in it, this group wants this in it, this group wants this in it, and then I want to do my thing with it too. And the more of those groups you have to add on, that's where I argue the diseconomy of scale comes in. For each extra cost, each unit goes up in value. So if you have 2 hours to tell one story,
I'm listening, by the way. Keep talking. Sorry, I just got an urgent call from my editor, so I just need to send him a message back.
But if you have, let's say you want to tell 2, 3, or 4 stories in the same amount of time, and maybe that was part of the deal that you get more, you get the resources you need to tell that story. Well, now you only have half an hour for each story, or if you want to treat them all equally, or maybe instead you welch on some of it, which in the long run won't be good. You probably won't get your money next time or your resources next time. But that pressure I could see easily developing and would lead to maybe not the same problem that an artist has today, but it would be a problem where the creativity of the artist would still be constrained by the need to persuade enough of the share of the decision-making process that they would say, okay, yeah, we'll give you resources because you're going to sort of glorify some aspect of our interest group that we like. And let me give you a tangible example. So, for example, I think it was The Gods of Egypt, Gerard Butler played a pharaoh, and there was a lot of people saying, well, it should have been an Indian guy, it should have been an Egyptian guy, it should have been someone else.
Well, there's a lot about Gods of Egypt that should have been different.
I'm not saying it's a good movie, but I'm saying is that kind of a pressure that we see today, I think we'll also see in a sort of socialist system. Which then,
I think we definitely would.
The danger I see with that is a kind of nitpicking police, where no socialist work is ever socialist enough because, obviously some things get left out because you got to tell a story. You have a fixed amount of time, fixed amount of resources. And you could see the rise of a nitpicking police, which would also, I think, in conjunction with trying to appeal to different interest groups, would hamper the artist's creativity.
I mean, that's definitely a danger. However, as I said in the debate, what I think you may be doing here is projecting realities from a current capitalist society that we have to deal with onto a socialist society. And those realities wouldn't necessarily exist in the same way. So if you're talking about identity politics, and we'll use Gods of Egypt and, Hollywood and the current heavy woke criticism that they've been getting lately. So from an arts perspective, and I understand this very well because I started out as an actor And particularly when it comes down to like minority casting and casting of women and other people, there's a couple of components to it. First off, there's the issue of representation. Communities get very invested in having representation for themselves in our mass media because, I mean, it has been shown in studies that children who are represented on television in various roles and stuff, like they get higher self-esteem the more TV they watch. And children from minorities who are not represented have lower self-esteem the more TV they watch because they don't see themselves meaningfully reflected back at them by our larger culture. It was almost interesting, like one of the few times I've felt this was actually watching Game of Thrones early on because I couldn't find a character to identify with for one of the first times ever. And it took me a little while to get past that. But that's just because it's often so easy for someone with my identity to find something. So there's an aspect of that. But then there's also, besides like the prestige of it and the fact that representation is actually important on like a physical material level, there's also the fact that there is this huge competition for roles within in acting in general. Like one of the most disturbing things that I noticed was when I did my first play in New York, which my first full-length play in New York was Mike, about the New York City underground open mic scene. And I had written a number of roles for people, and I tried to be as inclusive as possible and have as large a cast as possible because, one, I wanted to get a bunch of actors there so that they would invite their friends and family and make sure that even if a lot of people didn't see it, we would have an audience just from them. But also, like, I wanted to make sure that people got a chance to act because when I was in college, it was very, very difficult to get cast in anything. I almost didn't graduate on time because no one would cast me in their shows. And it wasn't that I was a bad actor. There were other aspects there. I was an okay actor. But so what I remembered was that when I put out a casting call for this show for the first time, there were only 2 roles for women in my show of like that I had written. I would say, close to, it was being performed by like 12 to 14 actors, and I'd written 2 female roles, and I just got this deluge of like 700 resumes from women, and all of them, with little exception, were all very well trained, very well. They were all trained. They all fit the role. They were all beautiful. They were all talented. And I'm like, holy crap. I thought I had it bad. I didn't realize it was this crazy just for being a woman. And then you take that for being a minority and you make it even harder. Like the fact is that there's a ridiculous amount of competition for roles because roles are not written for these people for the most part. And it's only been very recently that has been changing. So when there is the very rare role that can be played by someone of minority status, and then that role just goes to a white person, like I can, there just from a former actor standpoint, I can understand a very visceral and angry and frustrated reaction coming from somebody who has that background.
Well, let me point out that certainly there's a certain kind of unique mechanism going on now under the capitalist system. But let's look at, I guess, the closest thing we would have to socialism today, modern day sort of overtly left socialist movements. So one of the things that we see going on fairly commonly is infighting over why does my revolution have to wait for your revolution to happen. We see a lot of that, and we could see that manifest. We could, if we got to a point where art was created on a large enough scale, we could see that happening. We can imagine somebody making a story about, the classic workers' revolution against the state. And then you've got the feminists saying, well, where's my revolution? Then you've got the third world nationalists saying, where's my revolution? And it's like, well, we're not telling you revolution. We're telling the revolution of the working class against the bourgeoisie. But you could easily see that developing because, well,
sure. Well, let me get to, so that I was explaining there the frustration that comes with that. But what I wanted to explain is that, if we are in a socialist society where someone's productivity someone's access to the means of existence, to the food that they need to eat to live, and the house that they need to live in to not die of, exposure, are guaranteed by society, either through some form of welfare capitalism, or if we move in a more communist direction, they're guaranteed to all members of the society, regardless of what they do. There's going to be a lot more art. And there's going to be a lot more opportunities to get your art out there and to represent yourself than there would be within a society like what we have right now with our capitalist society, where most people are forced to work a job they hate for some capitalists that, towards some end that they don't even believe in, for a full 1/3 of their waking life, and are kind of living paycheck to paycheck. So there is no opportunity for a lot of people to create art. And for those of us who must create art, because that's what we were putting on this earth to do, we have to find an ability to do that outside of the marketplace, especially if it's the kind of art that doesn't sell well for one reason or another. Because there's huge financial barriers to entry. First off, like even just doing indie film, it's insane how expensive it is just to make like I wrote a web series. I thought it was a bargain basement web series, and just to shoot one 7-minute episode, I remember I took it to some indie producers, and they're like, "Okay, we can shoot this, but we need $30,000." And I'm like, "Okay, let's new plan." And theater in New York, like my first play, again, shoestring budget. Going, beg, borrowing, and stealing. All of the actors, for the most part, working for exposure, or working for, just a token fee, and volunteering not just their time, but their resources, their clothing, their musical instruments, all this stuff. That show still cost me $7,000 just to put it on for 1 week. So if with these barriers to entry removed, and when we have, I think that what you're going to see is you're going to see so much more art that more people are getting and feeling represented. And then there's less of a tendency to want to snipe at art that is existing at some of the higher levels. It's still going to happen because, we're artists, we're catty. But there's less of an incentive. If you can go out and put on your own show about your identity and your community and your people and get that out, and people have the ability to go and experience it, that is going to make those communities much more happy than right now, where really there is a total stranglehold on art for the most part, particularly via our institutions, and I mean both like political institutions, NEA grants, that kind of thing, and also through Hollywood, which is controlled by just a few major companies. And it's so bad, honestly, that you find it's almost impossible for a young artist who wants to act or wants to write or wants to do costume design to even get into that kind of art, unless they have unless they've got a super best friend high up in the system, or they've got a family member who's already famous and, again, high up in the system. So that kind of frustration both generates anti-capitalist rage, but I think it also generates rage from communities that don't feel that they don't see themselves reflected in our collective art in the society.
Oh, okay. So let's get to a point that you made about taking care of the sufficient level of material needs. Let's, again, with all these examples, there's going to be some room to quibble, but I think a good example that I think is a potential counterexample is Russia. Because if you look at Russia in the 19th century under the feudal czarist regime, very few people are going to actually, write that this is great. We want to repeat that system. But yet it generated a galaxy of musicians, composers, dancers, opera singers. It was a total galaxy. Yeah. And then with Bolshevism in Russia, maybe for the first 10, 20 years of Soviet Russia, we had some stuff. We had Battleship Potemkin, the groundbreaking film. But after 1945, and certainly by the 1980s, there's nothing to even compare with early Soviet art, let alone the galaxy of Tsarist Russian creators.
I'm going to point something out. You did make that point, and I'm going to point something out to you. What happened after 1945 that maybe really affected U.S.-Russian relations?
There was a lot of things that really affected it.
Yeah, but we won World War II.
Yeah.
And as a result, we had the Cold War setting in. So what I'm going to say is it's very unlikely that even if you had an incredible writer, an incredible Russian writer like Tolstoy, if it's the Cold War, the Americans will never admit that writer is actually good, and our institutions will not publish their works in English. They will not. The only time that you'll see during a period like the Cold War, Russian art begin to be well known within the United States is if the artist in general does something that the United States can use for propaganda. For instance, you've got Russian dancers coming over and defecting to the United States. Suddenly, oh, this guy, best ballerina in the world. Come and check him out. Ballerina, ballet man. Same thing could happen with artists. The same thing honestly happens now with China. There's a major Chinese artist. I forget his name, but he has been featured in a number of American museums, really prominently, huge, very cool, sculpture installations. Is it a coincidence that he is heavily critical of the Chinese government? No, it's not a coincidence at all. And that's a big part of why he's suddenly famous in the United States.
Well, I would push back a little bit and say that I think Sergei Eisenstein was always recognized as a great producer with his movie about the Battle of the Ice with the Teutonic Knights, the Battleship Potemkin. We've also had, Isaac Babel was a Soviet writer in the early 1920s, and then we also have but
1920s. Remember, that's prior to 1945.
But here's the other point, though, right? Let's look at Russia during the time of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. They're mired in the Great Game with the United Kingdom, and Russia and the United Kingdom are engaged in a sort of Cold War, as it were, over Central Asia. And so, for most of the 19th century, Russia was on England's most wanted list. And yet, I don't think anybody in England was going to say, well, I don't think Tolstoy's a great author. I don't think Dostoevsky.
Dude, I mean, again, look at how, I don't know how old you are, but do you remember when we first went to war in Iraq?
No, I was too young for that.
Okay. I remember this very well. And I remember when they for a while, the United States decided to hate everything French just because they didn't want to support us in that, to the point that where they tried to rename the hamburger, the freedom sandwich, and freedom fries was a big thing because they wouldn't say French fries. So the nations go through periods where they're extremely petty towards other nations for geopolitical reasons, and it's all political propaganda. Now, that's not a 100% foolproof system. You will always have people who don't agree and don't bend in, and will ignore that and work hard to, be a champion for art from another country. And you'll also have people who disagree with the Cold War or whatever, working to bring that art over here so Americans can see it. But again, you run into this really, really big problem, particularly with McCarthyism, because if you were perceived to have anything at all to do with Russians or communists during the McCarthy era, your life was ruined. And so, some of my favorite people, playwrights like, not Eugene O'Neill, he was earlier, but like Ilya Kazan, famously named names at the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and Arthur Miller, my favorite writer, refused. And I remember when Arthur Miller was trying to go on tour, his visa, like his passport, was denied by the United States. Like, they tried to make sure that other countries couldn't experience Arthur Miller's art because they disagreed with what he was saying with it. So,
well, let me just interject real quick here. I'm not arguing that we should determine what good art is based on what the United States thinks it is. But what I am saying is there are no Soviet Tolstoys. There are no Soviet Dostoevskys.
I mean, I'm going to disagree with you on that. But again, it's more, there are none that have woven themselves into the American zeitgeist because that was specifically suppressed during the time. Again, like, the fact that these figures loom very large in your mind and my mind is, one, a testament to their art, but two, it's also a testament to the institutions within our society that chose specifically to elevate them in our minds. In much the same way that one of the main reasons we remember who Shakespeare is, one, brilliant genius, but two, Shakespeare was elevated by England because he was chosen by the crown to justify, like, British imperialism. It's yet another, like, very socio-political thing where a country will put forth their artists as a means of creating popular propaganda around the world. We are allowed to run the world because we gave the world a genius like Shakespeare. What did India ever give the world? And it's not true, but I think this has a very large impact on what figures get remembered and what figures are forgotten or missed entirely.
I'm not going to say that doesn't happen, but the reason why I want to make this comparison is because Tolstoy stated under socialism, we would just have all of these geniuses. But if we look at the quote unquote art,
as did I, by the way,
if we look at the quote unquote art scene of late Tsarist Russia, say from like 1860 to 1913, I just don't see anything in comparison in the Soviet era.
Well, I think that's probably a factor of not looking far enough into the Soviet era, but also it may too be a factor of taste. The Soviet era had a very specific aesthetic, and again, a lot of it was political propaganda. You had your Soviet realism, and as I brought up in the debate, the Americans countered the Soviet realism by using the CIA to elevate figures, like Jackson Pollock, and to create, American abstract art the people who did this hated, like, I don't know if the individual CIA agents hated it, but the conservative forces, the people who hated the communists and the Soviets the most, also hated Jackson Pollock. But what they found was that the people in charge realized that Jackson Pollock's art could be used as a kind of counter propaganda to Soviet realism, because Soviet realism is very obviously propagandistic. It's very trying to be realistic. It's also trying to portray people as heroic. And Jackson Pollock's art is a bunch of splatters on the canvas, which then goes into, look how free this art is. Look at this great genius that America created by letting people be free, quote unquote. So, and this actually goes back to something really interesting. Alan Moore, one of my favorite comic book writers, and also an anarchist. Alan Moore has gone on the record as stating that artists are not really entertainers. Artists, writers, painters, poets. These are people who are essentially magicians. In the actual sense of the word, in the sense that when you create something via art, what you're doing is you are creating a change in consciousness in another person by the manipulation of symbols, images, ideas, and sounds, in much the same way that ritualistic magic is seen to work in a lot of our fiction. So, Alan Moore, as he put it, when he turned 40, decided to go completely mad and start telling everybody he was a wizard. But in a sense, he's not wrong about that. Like, art is a really, really interesting thing because, one, it's very heavily used for propaganda, but also two, art, especially when it's good art, it's about sharing something genuine about yourself and your experience with the audience. It's about creating a sudden connection between two people or millions and millions of people. So it's one, under capitalist society, I think that artists have kind of been sold up the river in much the same way of saying, oh, you're just entertainers. Which no, I really don't think we are. But also two, within any society, they're going to want to use that ability. Like the generals and politicos of the world are going to want to capture that ability and use it to their own ends, in much the same way that the Donald Trump campaign was trying to capture Kanye West and somewhat succeeded. You almost think of it as like each civilization has their priests and their magicians, and sort of like a clash of art between, say, Jackson Pollock and the Soviet realists is kind of can be seen as, we're going to get our wizards to do our magic at you, and you're going to get your wizards to do your magic at us, and we'll see what happens in the minds of humanity. Now, that's a very dramatic way to put it. And, I like that, again, theater. But I think there's something very much to that view of art and how art winds up getting expressed in various systems and then later incorporated into the zeitgeist and into history.
Yeah, okay, so there's 2 points here. I think one thing we can say is you are right. There is this aesthetic taste quality to it, and we can get into that in a moment. But I think one of the things is that would distinguish, say, great art from mere propaganda is, let's look at Richard III, right? Shakespeare's Richard III is clearly anti-Yorkist propaganda for the Tudors. That's obviously what it is. But it's sort of transcended mere propaganda. We can enjoy it completely disconnected from the unique political engagement that Shakespeare was trying to address. And in fact, it doesn't even feel dated. I mean, that's part of the genius of it. I mean,
well, that's Shakespeare. He really is as good as everybody says.
For example, like, there was that Ian McKellen film where Richard III is a fascist. So basically, it's not dated at all, really. And so what I'm saying is that's what Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were able to do. They were able to sort of transcend, in a sense, the limitations of the age and the purpose they were writing for, because we can still find it relevant and speak to us today.
Sure.
Now again, this is where we get into the partly, I guess, aesthetic. I don't think we've seen that with the Soviets, but
which is not to, my point there is, which is not to say that it's not there. It's just we haven't seen it.
Yeah. So let's put it this way, though. What makes good art, I guess, because I think on one sense there is a level of subjective aesthetic, but in another sense there isn't. Because if, for example, if you were to there's that one famous quote where Lenin says he can't listen to the Appassionata suite anymore because he makes them want to stroke people's heads rather than bash them in. But the point is, Lenin admits that, this is, excellent. Like, you can't argue with that, right? So someone on the spectrum of Lenin, say someone in the capitalist United States, they're both going to say, this is great art, despite whatever their subjective differences are. And I think one key thing is what Lewis and Tolkien described as the escape into reality. So you can create art which is escape from reality, or as I call the escape from consequences. And I think a good example would be Conan. If he has a problem, he just kills you. And apparently nobody ever seems to get mad that Conan kills all these people. Because in real life, if you just went around killing people like that, you'd have a whole bunch of posse chasing you down.
Yeah, he'd be like James Bond is another example.
Yeah, it's the worst kind of escapism, right? Because you're escaping consequences. You can do all these things, but see, there's no consequences and there's no tension. And if there's no tension, then what's the point of the story? And so what Lewis and Tolkien would say is that given the world we live in now is unreal in a lot of ways, the system that's been imposed on us is unreal. Good fiction is an escape into reality where we deal with the real issues that are going on. Of course, consequences are part of that, right? There are consequences. And I think that is at least a good place to start. The idea of an escape into reality, as Lewis and Tolkien would describe it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that's a great way to describe art, I think. And I would say that art, beyond like, because art is intensely, subjective. And like, I mean, one of the major reasons we know that Shakespeare actually lived and wrote, and this wasn't written down elsewhere, is we have like one of the main surviving primary sources on Shakespeare is a bad review that was written. It was this guy basically going like, hey, here's this Shakespeare asshole, and he thinks he can write plays as good as all of these much more upper class writers. What a rube. This work is garbage. Like literally, like that's what it's saying in like 17th century terminology. It's throwing a lot of shade. And so good art is not necessarily art that everyone will respond to, but I think when you respond to art, when you're touched by something, I'm wearing a shirt from one of my favorite bands, the Crew Shadows, and Rogue actually says, the lead singer, he says in one of his lyrics is like, "There's a fragment of me in the words I'm giving. A doorway is opened if you listen too long." So art, I think good art is art that can build that kind of connection between two disparate individuals that can transcend personal, cultural, and even temporal boundaries. And the more it's able to do that, I would say the better and more powerful it is, the stronger your spell, if I'm to use that. There's also like art, you pointed out Conan, which is a power fantasy essentially, and there's some true stuff in Conan, but I think it's not so much about the Conan story. The truth of Conan is presented in the fantasy that Conan embodies, is something that a lot of men in our current world sort of feel, in much the same way that if you watch Sin City, like Marv has this whole bit about like one of the characters is talking about Marv, the Mickey Rourke character, and it says that he had the rotten luck to be born in the wrong century. And it very much strikes me that that's a true thing, because a lot of guys, if given the chance to live life as Conan, would love to do it, and that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. Now, obviously, the reality of Conan is impossible. And there was never a time when there was a Conan. Like, I don't think even in the era that it depicts that things weren't like that.
Well, we put it this way. In the Iliad, which has a similar amount of violence, everybody gets checked up pretty bad.
Yeah.
Nobody walks away clean like Conan walks away. Even if you win, you have your scars you take home with you.
Yeah. Even if you're invincible, like, even if you're not Hector. Achilles, thank you. Yeah. Even if you're invincible like Achilles, you die. Like, so yeah, I would say the Iliad is probably superior to Conan the Barbarian.
But I think one of the points is, again, this is deviating from the aesthetic a little bit. The idea that I would agree that certain level of physical needs need to be met to be able to produce art. If you have to worry about mundane things like a paycheck, because if you're working for like some rich aristocrat, he just says, I'll write you a blank check whenever you want. Well, that's great. You be Shakespeare, write all your plays. Don't have to worry about it. So if that's taken off the table, then you can focus. But what I would question is, I don't know if you can take everything off the table, because if there's no struggle, it's very difficult to see how art can be produced, because a lot of the great works that we remember are those works where either the creator himself was struggling to overcome some obstacle and then he did it through his art, or his characters do. But partly also, life imitates art. And so these people are often going from their own experiences, right? Their own struggles then go into the art. If you have somebody that doesn't struggle at all and hasn't had to struggle, well, what kind of stories can he really tell? It's almost like if you can have too much of a good thing.
Oh, yeah. No, I think you're entirely right. And what's really interesting is the series One Punch Man really deals with this. in the sense that have you ever watched One Punch Man, by the way, like at least the first season?
Okay, I'm not a huge anime dude, but no.
Okay, so I have a heterodox interpretation of One Punch Man. I think One Punch Man is actually about being an artist, but like being an undiscovered artist that nobody knows about. Because if you look at like Saitama as a character, he is this incredibly overpowered protagonist who, in a very childlike way, can defeat every single one of his enemies with one punch. But they've got like a hero ranking system, and he gets ranked like a C-class hero because he didn't do well on the written test. And like he lives in a crappy apartment and like goes to shop for, he has to make sure to like pinch pennies and get the supermarkets when it's the sale because he barely has any money. And the series grows from there. But as One Punch Man keeps like saving the day, he doesn't get credit for it because everyone assumes that a C-class hero could never do the things that he does. So obviously some other hero did it. And then there's even like very catty kind of competition between heroes as to who's like the one and who gets the most fan mail and all this stuff. And it's really fascinating. And I really think what the truth in One Punch Man that the artist is coming from is he's coming from a place before he was discovered as a undiscovered, ignored artist whose work just simply wasn't connecting with enough people because people were not primed to receive it. There's a big thing that I noticed, which is Josh Bell. Joshua Bell is one of the best violinists in the world. He plays Carnegie Hall, sells it out every single time, makes thousands of dollars an hour just to play his violin. And they did an experiment where they set him up to busk in the DC subway during rush hour. So Josh Bell, remember, brilliant artist, objectively one of the best violin players that you could ever have, goes to play and nobody cares. Nobody listens. The longest anyone listened to him was like 2.5 minutes. And the person who was listening to him was a toddler who was then pulled away by their mother on the way. He made maybe $12, $13 in change from the people going by. And so one of the things that about art and artistic appreciation that proved was that people may not recognize the presence of objectively good, great art if they are not already psychologically primed to realize that they're hearing it. And similarly, if they are psychologically primed that what they're going to experience is suddenly great art, even if you give them garbage, a lot of them will convince themselves that it is great art. Like, I don't know if you know about this, but literally every, with almost no exception, every Broadway production of every play ever that is ever on Broadway gets a standing ovation every night. I don't think there's ever been an exception to this. And it's even when the plays that are on Broadway are objectively garbage and are only there because some rich people wanted them there. Like the audience, and this is a Midwestern audience usually, it's mostly tourists, it's not sophisticated New Yorkers or anything, get up and they clap every time. And why did they clap every time? Well, because they spent $400 on their tickets. And God damn it, I'm going to go to Broadway, and God damn it, I'm going to see something brilliant, and I'm going to clap at the end and stand up. So there a lot really goes into the experience of art, and it's really fascinating, both in those terms and then also how this interacts with like market dynamics and market intelligence.
Well, I would totally agree that people have to sort of develop the aesthetic sense. They're not born with it, and they may not see it if they don't have it.
Though I'll point something out. Who was the one that listened to Josh Bell? It was a 2-year-old. It was a 2-year-old. Who hadn't been conditioned by society to ignore beautiful things.
Well, and the thing is, though, that this also then gets into the question is it, I mean, obviously the current iteration of capitalism is having these incentives. But if we look at America in the 19th century, at least in certain arts, like literature, I think like Moby Dick with Herman Melville, of these other authors. This is obviously a capitalist economy, but yet a lot of these really great authors were getting produced. I think it's related, but I think there are other factors also that have shifted the whole market dynamic. Because I don't think you could have Herman Melville today. Someone like him just would not make it. But he did make it once upon a time.
Yeah. Well, I would also say you can't ever have an artist of a previous era within a new era. Like great artists are as much a product of their circumstances as they are a product of, like, individual genius. A great example also would be The Princess Bride. The film The Princess Bride could never be made today. And it's, again, kind of a perfect movie. But even it's a miracle it happened even in the 80s. But can you imagine if, Hollywood went and tried to do The Princess Bride today, like with like kind of Michael Bay and Zack Snyder type sensibilities?
Yeah, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't. But so the what was I going to double back on? It was no, we already covered resources. Oh no, there's one other thing too about resources. So I don't know this. I don't play these kinds of video games. My brother does. So Steam, the client Steam, owns Valve, and Valve is behind a lot of the really popular games. One of them was Portal back in I think 2007. Basically, what happens right now is what he told me is that Steam is subsidizing Valve basically from the sale of all of its other content, which is basically saying, like, look, okay, all this other stuff you don't have to worry about. We're going to subsidize you to go make stuff. Yeah. And Valve has just really gone down. Like they're not producing that crazy stuff that everybody loves from like 10 to 15 years ago. When they didn't have, a blank check, when they really were struggling to produce content. And it would seem that from looking at Valve, that when they didn't have everything taken care of, they were actually striving to create these really great games that would sell, because they needed them to sell, in part because but now that everything's taken care of, there's been a steady decline in Valve's productivity of these amazing games that they have.
I would agree. I don't know about Valve. I do remember I did play Portal all the way through, and I absolutely loved it. And I played the Half-Life 2, and of course Half-Life 3 still coming, still on the way. So, I might say that maybe that's a factor of them being too comfortable, but it could be a number of other factors. It might have been losing a particular designer or team of designers, or moving to, something else. Oftentimes, an artist's inspiration is born from our own struggles. I will tell you, I would not be nearly as good as I am today if I had been picked up as a wonderkind, and had my art, thrown across the stage. But also, interestingly enough, this goes back to Joseph Stalin. So a lot of people don't know this about Stalin, but Stalin was actually a brilliant poet. Like, he was legitimately really good, and was recognized at a very early age. He was like 17, and got like heralded as like the next great Russian poet. And, got published in a lot of things, and his work got widely circulated. He got a ton of, adoration for it. And there probably is like a timeline where Joseph Stalin is a poet and not a despot. But because I think partially because he got that much adoration that fast at a very, very young age, he abandoned poetry and instead went after, being a political radical. And there were a lot of factors that led to that happening, from, his upbringing to a particular school, like divinity school he was sent to become a priest that had a reputation for creating atheists and, dictators. A lot of Stalin's paranoid sensibilities when it came to like surveilling and playing mind games at the people underneath him actually came from this one priest called Black Spot, because he had a big black mole on his head, who like tortured Joseph Stalin and eventually got him thrown out of the seminary. So like, again, I think that if things are too easy for an artist, there is a chance that their work will stagnate or won't speak to people. But I think that's also a function of things being very hard for everyone within the society. So if an artist has a number of experiences that are more or less universal, they're able to take, and when they're expressing themselves, what's really happening is they're expressing the universal in a very particular way. So if things get really easy for artists, but don't get easy for the rest of the population, yeah, you've got a real danger of stagnation there. However, if things get easier for artists and get easier for the rest of the population at the same time, I think what you're going to find is there's great art that relates to the struggle and the experience of being in a civilization where things have gotten easier for one way or another. I know, like, I was raised pretty well to do, and one of the driving forces behind my creativity that like pushed me to first hike the Appalachian Trail, Maine to Georgia, and then write the play North to Maine, and then remark about this on North to Maine, was that I had felt like a little too sheltered growing up. And that experience wasn't universal, but it was more universal in the 1990s when the economy was good. One of the few times when the economy was really good, than it was at any other time in American history. So I would say that, simply making things easier for artists could be dangerous, but I think it's less dangerous if you're making things easier across the board than if you're just coddling artists.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how that would work, because if it's easier for everybody, then the sort of struggles in either the artist's life or in his observation of other people, they won't be able to be translated into the work because it's not there to be translated. I mean, if somebody just wakes up and has an easy life all the way through, I don't know how you can tell a story with that. I guess you could, but...
Yeah, well, what I mean is I don't think it's actually possible for a human to have an easy life all the way through, no matter what your circumstances are. And now this is very Buddhist of me, but the fact is that stress is relative. And in much the same way that like our psychology does not allow us to ever be fully sated when it comes to experience, or when you start getting paid $75,000 a year, you have the same problems that you had when you had $50,000 a year, or you may not have exactly the same problems, but suddenly you have different problems. And then when you go from $75,000 a year to $150,000 a year, you find that things don't actually change that much for you psychologically. And this is because stress is relative. And honestly, people living in war zones, don't necessarily experience much more elevated levels of stress than people not living in war zones. Or sometimes they actually experience higher feelings of fulfillment. A big thing was in London during the Blitz. They were really worried that they would have this outbreak of like mental health issues because they were getting bombed every night, and the Nazis were flying over and everything. And what they found was that the British population overall was happier during the Blitz than they had been before the war had really happened, because suddenly things mattered, and there was purpose to life, and it was exciting and interesting, despite the fact that it was also really, really incredibly difficult. So I don't know. I think, again, this is part of human psychology and the fact that we naturally adapt to our surroundings, that you get to a point where you'll always torture yourself to a certain extent, no matter how comfortable your life is. and you'll always want more, no matter how much you have. It's part of why the Buddhists say samsara is nirvana, that there's no actual change in your external environment. The change is in the way that you interact with it.
Yeah, well, we're about at the end. Thanks for coming on, Brenton. Is there anything you want to end with before we wrap this up?
Yeah, well, it's been great to talk to you, Todd. It's been a while since we streamed, and I really enjoyed our debate, and I really enjoyed talking to you here. We got to go into some really fun depth. The main thing that I'd just say to the audience, being that we spent this whole time talking about art, my comic series Snow White Zombie Apocalypse we are on issue 3 is about to go to print. I've still got pre-orders up, and I can put the link into the chat if anybody wants to grab something. There's a bunch of cool swag and stuff. It doesn't look like I can put it into the regular chat, so Todd, maybe you can add it. Yeah, I just sent it to you. But yeah, please go check that out if you want to get in on the series at the ground floor. It's really good. It's dark fantasy mixed with 70s kung fu with strong political overtones. So I think everybody is really going to like it. Keep an eye out, because I've got some other series on the horizon, and I'm going to be doing some more debates. You can look me up on YouTube. Just Google my name, Brenton Lengel. Thank you.
All right. And thank you. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.